A trembling hush fell over Jerusalem as dawn broke, but the silence did not last. From the city walls, terrified eyes watched armored shadows advancing like an unstoppable tide. Within minutes, gates buckled, screams erupted, and chaos devoured the streets. No one knew who would survive the day, only that mercy had fled long before the Crusaders arrived. The city braced for fate no prayer can stop.
The summer heat hung over Jerusalem like a suffocating veil when the Crusaders finally reached its ancient walls. News of their approach had raced ahead of them, stories of zeal, of fury, of cities trembling in their wake. Yet nothing had prepared the people within for the relentless determination these armored pilgrims carried in their hearts. For years, Jerusalem had been a crossroads of faiths, cultures, and rulers, shifting between hands like a sacred prize. But on this morning, as dust clouds billowed across the plains and thousands of Crusaders tightened their formation, the city understood that the balance of its world was about to break. The defenders knew the siege had been coming. For weeks, food supplies dwindled, water grew scarce, and anxiety carved deep lines into the faces of the population. Even the most seasoned soldiers felt unease, for the Crusaders were not merely an army. They were thousands driven by divine conviction, convinced that reclaiming the city was not a political mission, but a heavenly command. The certainty in their eyes was more frightening than their weapons. When the final assault began, it struck with the force of a tidal wave. Siege towers rolled forward, pushed by men chanting prayers that shook the air with fervor. Arrows darkened the sky. Shields clashed. Ladders scraped against stone walls. The defenders fought with desperate resolve, but with every hour, the Crusaders gained ground. Their relentless push was fueled not by strategy alone, but by an almost burning belief that nothing, not walls, not men, not fear itself, could deny them victory. As the gates finally cracked open under the weight of the attack, panic spread across the city like wildfire. Families fled into alleys seeking shelter, while soldiers tried to organize a final stand within the inner quarters. The Crusaders surged inward, their banners catching the sun as they moved through the narrow streets. Many sought refuge in the holy sites they believed would shield them from harm, but even sacred places could not halt the sweeping advance of an army convinced it carried out divine purpose. Within moments, Jerusalem's familiar rhythms were shattered. Roads once filled with merchants and pilgrims now echoed with shouts of confusion, fear, and command. Smoke began to rise as buildings were breached and fires sparked in the chaos. The invaders pressed deeper into the heart of the city, determined to seize every district. The people trapped inside felt the weight of centuries converging on this single day, a day that would be remembered not for triumph or salvation, but for the overwhelming calamity unfolding around them.
The Crusaders advanced with a discipline forged by months of hardship. Their armor was dented, their boots torn from the long march across continents, yet their resolve remained unbroken. Every step they took carried echoes of sermons spoken by distant leaders, words that promised absolution, glory, and eternal reward. Such promises hardened them more than steel ever could. Inside the city, fear spiraled. Residents barricaded themselves in homes, clutching what little possessions they could carry. The sound of approaching footsteps made entire families hold their breath. Many turned to prayer, whispering verses that had guided generations before them. In moments like these, they hoped faith might bend fate. But the Crusaders poured through the streets with unstoppable momentum. They moved in waves, not pausing even when the resistance broke apart. Soldiers who had defended the walls were pushed back toward the heart of the city, their lines collapsing under the sheer force of the assault. Even the courage of the bravest defenders seemed fragile when confronted with an army that believed its actions were sanctified. Holy sites became refuges for the terrified. Hundreds gathered inside mosques and churches, hoping the sanctity of the buildings would shield them. Yet outside, the roar of thousands grew louder, and the smoke drifted through windows like a grim omen. No place felt safe. The city's most ancient stones seemed to tremble as if sensing the enormity of what was unfolding. By midday, Jerusalem was caught in a storm unlike any it had endured. Its soaring towers cast long, trembling shadows over the chaos. The clash between conviction and desperation had consumed every street, every courtyard, every heart still beating within the walls. Crowds of civilians drifted toward the center of the city, drawn by an instinct to find safety in numbers. Yet the growing panic only deepened their dread. Leaders attempted to calm them, raising their voices above the uproar, but even their words faltered against the reality that the Crusaders had breached the defenses. Throughout the city, the thunder of armored boots, the clamor of shouts, and the rising smoke painted a picture of a population standing at the threshold of irreversible change. As the sun continued its climb, heat pressed down upon Jerusalem, amplifying exhaustion and despair. Those who still resisted fought in fragmented groups, their efforts brave but futile against the coordinated surge of the Crusaders. Others simply hid, awaiting whatever fate approached. Above it all, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, its stones absorbing the echoes of a day that would alter its story for generations to come.
The deeper the Crusaders pushed into Jerusalem, the more organized their advance became. Their commanders barked instructions that cut sharply through the noise, directing squads to secure intersections, seal off alleys, and force defenders into shrinking pockets of resistance. Every captured street gave them more momentum, and soon the city's vast network of pathways became channels guiding their inevitable triumph. Civilians who had once walked these routes on peaceful mornings now fled down them in desperation, clutching loved ones or what few treasured possessions they could carry. In many neighborhoods, the defenders attempted to mount counterattacks, but exhaustion weighed heavily on their movements. Weeks of siege had drained their strength, and their weapons were dull from constant use. They fought with courage born of necessity, yet even the fiercest confrontations were brief. The Crusaders advanced with unwavering determination, stepping over broken barricades and weaving through toppled market stalls without losing formation. Their march carried the confidence of men who believed every action, no matter how harsh, served a divine plan. Jerusalem's architecture, once admired for its beauty and cultural richness, became an obstacle course of ruins as fighting raged from house to house. Homes were shattered by force, walls cracked, and narrow streets filled with dust that clung to the air. The scent of burning wood and oil lingered everywhere, mingling with the oppressive summer heat. Windows shattered under the pressure of the advancing troops, and abandoned belongings lay scattered across the stone pavements, quiet reminders of the lives interrupted by the day's brutality. As the Crusaders reached the city's spiritual heart, the tension grew even thicker. Sacred sites that had stood for centuries seemed to hold their breath, as though aware of the calamity unfolding around them. Hundreds of civilians gathered near these places, believing that what was holy might remain untouched. Families huddled under archways, children crying softly into their parents' arms, while elders whispered prayers that felt increasingly fragile. The atmosphere carried a haunting stillness, broken only by distant clashes drawing steadily nearer. The Crusader leaders, however, had no intention of slowing their advance. They urged their men onward, insisting that the day's outcome must become a testament to their faith and resolve. Some soldiers recited verses as they marched, their voices trembling with emotion, their breath heavy beneath metal helmets. To them, The suffering of the city was not a tragedy, but a necessary trial, a passage that would reward their devotion. This sense of sanctified purpose hung heavily over every step they took.
Within the courtyard of a large religious complex, crowds gathered in growing numbers. Some argued anxiously about what to do. Others stared at the entrance in quiet dread. They knew the Crusaders were only streets away. The building's stone walls, once symbols of protection, now felt paper-thin in the face of the approaching force. A few defenders attempted to fortify the entrances with overturned benches and barrels, but their efforts were more symbolic than strategic. They worked quickly, driven by fear rather than hope. The city's leaders, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond control, sought to negotiate with pockets of Crusader forces. Messengers carrying tokens of peace ran through side streets, waving white cloths and attempting to convey surrender. But confusion and chaos hindered their efforts. Some messengers never reached their destinations. Others found Crusaders who were too overwhelmed by the frenzy of victory to listen. The chain of communication dissolved into scattered pleas lost amid the uproar. Meanwhile, groups of Crusaders clustered in key plazas, securing choke points before pushing further inward. Their commanders studied the layout of the city, tracing paths that led to strongholds and sanctuaries. Step by step, they tightened their grip around the remaining areas of resistance. The light of the setting sun cast long shadows behind them, turning the streets into corridors of shifting darkness. As more buildings burned, their flames illuminated the dust-filled air with an eerie glow. Inside the occupied districts, silence slowly replaced the chaos. The defenders who survived withdrew deeper into the city's final strongholds, leaving behind abandoned weapons and broken shields. The civilians who had witnessed the battles sat in corners, trembling, afraid to move. Though the Crusaders continued their advance, it became clear that Jerusalem's fate was already sealed. The city had fought with all its strength, but the enemy it faced was armed with more than steel. They were armed with belief. The loss of control spread like a shadow across every remaining pocket of resistance. Doors were barred, lanterns dimmed, and voices fell to whispers. The once bustling city now felt like a labyrinth of dread, its familiar landmarks almost unrecognizable in the haze of smoke and dust. Those who had once walked proudly through its gates now found themselves praying not for victory, but for survival. And still the Crusaders came. Their march echoed through the streets as they pressed deeper into the heart of Jerusalem, their banners fluttering like omens in the hot wind. The final confrontation loomed ahead, unavoidable and absolute. The people of the city braced themselves for what would follow, knowing that by sunset, the world they had known would vanish into memory.
As the final districts collapsed under Crusader control, the sun dipped lower, painting the rooftops in a dim copper glow. The last defenders gathered near the remaining fortified compounds, forming thin lines that stretched across courtyards and doorways. They knew these positions would not hold, yet the instinct to protect their families, their faith, and their home refused to surrender easily. Their armor was cracked, their clothes stiff with dust and sweat, and their movements sluggish from exhaustion. But their eyes still carried the fire of those who had not abandoned hope completely. The Crusaders met this weakened resistance with the full weight of their determination. Each squad advanced with precision, tightening their grip on the city's heart. They forced back defenders step by step, pushing them through arched passageways and narrow stone lanes. Every inch of ground was contested. Every doorway became a threshold between life and death. The sound of clashing metal filled the air as the Crusaders pressed forward with unwavering intensity, driven by commanders who insisted the day must end with absolute dominion. Within one of the city's largest religious complexes, hundreds of civilians gathered for shelter. The courtyard was crowded with families clutching one another, their faces pale with fear. Elders whispered prayers, mothers soothed crying infants, and children hid behind pillars as the distant echoes of combat drew nearer. The building's towering walls, once seen as sacred protection, now felt fragile. Every tremor of the ground made people flinch. They had no certainty that any sanctuary would be respected by the conquerors. As Crusader troops closed in on the complex, the defenders stationed there braced themselves for the final encounter. Torches flickered along the hallways, casting twisted shadows on the stone surfaces. The defenders exchanged weary glances, silently acknowledging that their stand would likely be their last. They adjusted their grips on worn-out weapons, forcing back rising panic. Their breaths came shallow and rapid as they heard the unmistakable roar of an army approaching at full force. The Crusaders stormed into the outer courtyard with a surge of energy that shattered any illusion of safety. Their arrival triggered a wave of terrified cries from the civilians inside the complex. Defenders rushed to intercept them, engaging in frantic, desperate combat. The courtyard erupted into chaos, swords flashing, shields splintering, bodies colliding with brutal force. The Crusaders moved with precision, breaking through improvised barricades and overwhelming the thinning defensive line. Bit by bit, they pushed further into the sanctuary's interior. Inside the main hall, the panic escalated. Civilians clung to each other as the shrieks of battle grew louder. The air was thick with fear, and the heat of burning buildings outside seeped through cracks in the stone walls. The hall, once a place of solemn rituals and quiet reflection, now felt like a cage tightening around everyone within it. Some attempted to flee outside passages, only to be turned back by blocked routes or incoming Crusader squads. Others simply collapsed to their knees in prayer, unable to act any further.
When the Crusaders breached the inner chambers, the last line of defenders made a final stand that lasted only minutes. Their resolve, though admirable, could not withstand the sheer momentum of an army fueled by conviction and victory. One by one they fell, their weapons slipping from their hands. The Crusaders moved inexorably through the hall, their armor streaked with dust and soot, their breaths heavy with the heat of battle. The massacre that followed spread rapidly throughout the complex and the surrounding streets. Civilians who had sought refuge within these walls were met with no mercy. Their desperate cries filled the chambers as the Crusaders advanced, leaving devastation in their wake. The stone floors, once polished by centuries of reverence, became slick with the day's grim outcome. The weight of history seemed to press down upon the scene, as though the city itself recoiled from what it was being forced to witness. Outside, the sun finally set, sinking below the horizon as smoke drifted through the sky in thick plumes. The city's skyline was marked by burning rooftops and collapsed structures. The echo of screams eventually faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the heavy footsteps of Crusaders securing their control. Jerusalem's ancient streets, once alive with marketplaces, prayers, and daily laughter, now lay silent under the cloak of night. The devastation reached every district, sparing no community, no household. As darkness took full hold, the Crusaders raised their banners atop the highest points in the city. Their leaders proclaimed the conquest complete, declaring the day's violence a sacred triumph. The soldiers, weary but triumphant, moved through the ruins with an air of grim accomplishment. Some offered prayers over the destruction, convinced that the city's suffering had been necessary. Others stood in contemplative silence, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what had unfolded. By the next morning, the scale of the massacre was painfully clear. Streets remained strewn with the remnants of the previous day's horror. Courtyards that once hosted lively gatherings were now scenes of tragic stillness. The surviving population wandered through the devastation in a stunned haze, searching for lost family members, gathering the courage to face the new reality imposed upon their home. Jerusalem, a city revered by countless generations, had been transformed beyond recognition in a single day. The Crusaders established their authority quickly, stationing guards throughout the city and fortifying key structures. Yet even as they strengthened their control, an unspoken heaviness lingered. The magnitude of the bloodshed cast a shadow over their victory, settling into every shattered neighborhood and burned-out street. The massacre of tens of thousands would echo far beyond the city walls, becoming a legacy that future generations would question, debate, and mourn. For those who lived through it, however, the legacy was not written in chronicles, but etched into memory, an enduring reminder of how swiftly faith, fear, and power can converge into catastrophe. And in the quiet after the storm, as the sun rose over the battered skyline, Jerusalem stood as both a symbol of conquest and a monument to the immense human cost carried by a single day of unimaginable violence.